And we'll start off by saying hello. So welcome, thank you so much for joining, both in the UK and the US and potentially from other places. So whether it's the afternoon for you or the morning, thank you so much for spending one of the first days of 2021 here with us. I'm Lila, I'm one of the directors at Hands Up, and you'll be hearing from me today, as well as from Hannah, Tony, and a little bit from Will. So Hannah does our illustrations and design, and she's one of the directors of Hands Up. And Tony does our digital development, so he's built all the software for Suburani. And Will, who is sort of Mr. Everything, has done loads of work on Suburani, but he's at short notice had to travel to France. So though he's here, and some of you might see him waving, he's going to join us more for the questions and answers at the end. So if you've got any questions for Will, do share them and we'll get to those later on. If at any point in the session you have anything you want to ask or remark upon, you have any ideas or questions, then you should find on your screen a little chat button and you can type your question in there, or and one of our team will try to respond to you. Otherwise, we have a time at the end of the session, so you can save up your comments and questions for then as well. I hope that most people are here, so we'll get going on the important stuff. I'm going to hand over first of all to Tony, who's going to tell you the most important things. Book 2 of Suburani, when is it going to be there? What is happening with it? Because that's what we're all here to hear about. So I'm going to hopefully mute myself and unmute Tony so that he can tell you everything.
Okay, hello everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I'm going to go quick run through of the timeline of development, and pretty much it's all there on the screen. In 2017, we got going on Hands Up Education. We founded Hands Up Education, and although we cover a lot of different ground in classical education, our main project at the moment is Suburani, this new Latin course for roughly 11 to 16-year-old students. 2017 to 18 was when we were really getting going with it. 2019 to 20 school year, we got a number of schools in the UK and the US to run a trial, and that was very valuable for feedback. And as you probably know, we're a community interest company. It's a community project, and we really value input from other people. What we produce, any profits go back into the project, and we very much welcome input from you about any aspect, large or small. I'll give you sort of contact details later, or Lila or Hannah will. Anyway, in 2020 September, we had book 1 out in schools. The books were shipped over the summer to schools, so they had time to prepare. And so it's being taught in a lot of places now. Thousands of kids have got digital access and so on. And we're hoping to do, well, we will do the same thing for book 2. So we're trialing that this year. And next September, it'll be ready for teaching, and you'll be able to receive the books in advance during the summer. It was difficult this year because of the COVID situation, getting the books out in time, but we did do a pretty good job, I hope. Anyway, I'll talk a bit about the costs of the books now. We're going to keep the prices exactly as they were for the first book. That is £20 for a paperback in the UK, and in the US we've got paperback and a hardcover editions at $55 and $75. As well as that, we've got digital subscriptions. There's a lot of digital support, print material, interactive material on the website, and I'll talk about that later. But just about the prices here, schools we expect to have, they start off with a starter pack, which gives you 8 seats, eight user accounts, which can be allocated either to teachers or to students. And then on top of that, depending how many students you've got, you'll have individual accounts added to that. So I've got an example here. The UK starter pack is £30. Individual students, £2.50 each. So say you had a school with two teachers, 30 students, then you'll get one starter pack for 8. You'll need 24 additional ones, and the annual cost of that in the UK would be £90. In the US, the starter pack's 40 and the additional account's 4. So the total cost of that for a year is $136. And we feel that's pretty good. And the feedback we've had is that's a pretty good value for what you're getting, and compared with other similar materials for other languages or whatever. You can find this information on our website. You can go directly there at suburani.com, or you can go to handsupeducation.org, hands-up-education.org, and there's a link down to Suburani there. But it also gives you a chance to explore what else we've been involved with. We've got a fantastic primary Latin course for you younger students, highly illustrated, but well thought out introduction to Latin, and that's entirely free, digital only. But you might be interested in that. There's also Greek materials and civilization, wonderful book about the Persians. But anyway, today we're talking about Suburani, and I think I will hand over to Lila now to continue.
Thank you. Yes, I'll talk you through briefly what we're going to be doing today. So we're going to be looking at book 2. Not all of book 2 exists yet, but an encouraging part of it does. And today we'll talk to you about all aspects of it and tell you what's already there, what's planned. And at the end, there'll be an opportunity for you to ask questions or to tell us if you've got some amazing idea for what book 2 absolutely must include. You can let us know. So we're going to start out by talking about the language. So what linguistic features will the book cover, and in what order and in which chapters. Then we'll look at the storyline and civilization topics for all of book 2, going through in order. So you'll see everything that the book covers, and a little note on what mythology and history sections there will be for the book. Finally, we'll have a little update from Tony about what's happening on the technology front for book 1 and book 2, what's been happening and what's new. And then we're hoping at the end there'll be enough time to talk to all of you and hear your questions and hopefully be able to answer them. So do store up the questions as you go. And I'll start you off with talking about the language for book 2. So this potentially at first confounding table shows you per chapter of Suburani exactly what we'll be covering. Now, if you're in the UK, you'll see that we're referring in certain places to syllabus content that's part of the UK exams, the GCSEs, for both EDUCAS and OCR. If you're in the US, those words might not mean anything to you, and so you're very free to just ignore those. And when I talk about it, try not to get too confused, but the topics don't change. So there's a color coding system going on here so that we could have a chance to work out the balance of what kind of topics we're dealing with. So we've got topics that are more accidents and verb related, and ones that are syntax heavy. So when we come to planning the book, we try to make sure that we do these things in an order that makes sense to us, and that means that we don't do the same thing all bunched together. So as you can see here, there's a few columns, and there's language 1, language 2, language 3 you'll see at the top, and those are the 3 topics for each chapter. Probably they'll translate into 3 language notes that might not go in that order, and some will be very small and some will be bigger, and there'll be exercises separately. And then in the final column there's additional language, and that is a column of items that are not going to be in the book, but that will be available separately for those schools who wish to look at them. So UK teachers, those tend to include topics that maybe aren't part of the exam syllabus, that are there to stretch your students slightly. So there will be materials to do that with, and we suggest that you can do them at this point in the course because it will fit in well with what else your students are doing, but those are not topics that will be in the physical pages of the book. So if we go through in order and we start at chapters 17 to 19, which are set in Pompeii, you'll see there's a lot of green, and that's because we start off with finishing up the last bits of verbs that to flesh out all the tenses and all the conjugations that we didn't finish up in book 1. So we'll start chapter 17 with the pluperfect and move on to the future in chapter 18, have a note on the conjugations in chapter 17 as well. So we'll be filling out the tables that might not have been complete at the end of book 1 to include all the tenses and to include all the conjugations. And then we'll move on to the present participle as the main topic for chapter 19. So that's a new bit of the verb that will be a bit different and a bit more really kind of nearly syntaxy to cope with. So that's got a chapter of its own. Moving on then to North Africa, we're moving on to a section of 3 chapters that focus on passives as well as deponents. So we're looking at both verb forms and the syntax related with creating the passive voice. And we'll start out in chapter 20 with the present and the imperfect, which are the slightly simpler versions to get to grips with, and they look very similar to each other. So they'll see the passive endings and they'll see them on a stem that they're familiar with before we move on in chapter 21 to doing the perfect past participle and the perfect passive. So they'll finally then see the third form of the verb. So we'll be able to list verbs from then on with all of its full forms. So we'll have amo, amare, amawi, and we'll also now finally have amatus, amatum, and have a complete listing in the dictionary from then on. And you'll see there as the third language note that we've got a pluperfect passive tense as well in chapter 21, and that's just an OCR topic. So that'll be, if you're doing EDUCAS, you can skip over that, or you can do it as well, but we will make sure that it's flagged for you, that you know which topics are part of your GCSE syllabus if you're a UK teacher, and which bits you might not find as relevant to your students. Chapter 22, we'll look at deponent verbs, so we'll see those passive forms again, but now in verbs that have an active meaning. And we will introduce those relatively gradually. So though they do see deponent verbs in 22, it won't be immediately all of them. And throughout those chapters, there'll be a mix of passive forms and deponent forms that keep being reincorporated into the stories. So in those 3 chapters and beyond, we'll be repeating those forms as much as possible in the text, so they become more and more proficient at spotting them and working out which is a passive and which is a deponent and how to translate them. In chapter 23 at the bottom of this page, we're moving to Rome for a standalone chapter to introduce the subjunctive. We start doing that with just cum clauses and introducing both the pluperfect and the imperfect tenses, meaning both when and since, and also opening up the possibility for students to translate to cum clauses because. And that's our first introduction to the subjunctive in the simplest syntactical form that they'll see it. Before we move on, and now I'm going to go to the next slide, there you go, hopefully you can all see that, to the Greece chapters, which are 24 to 26. Now here we'll cover the rest of the subjunctive, I've lost the word completely, constructions that your students might see, and if you're in the UK, that's all of the GCSE syllabus constructions. And we're introducing them in the order that you see here. So we'll start in 24 with result clauses, and then we'll move on to 25 indirect commands and questions, and 26 purpose clauses, as well as dum and the present tense. Now, the order there is something we thought about quite a lot. We went back and forth about what is the most natural order to do this in. We discovered that many teachers do this in many different ways. But the final plan that we've come up with is based on the understanding that they're going to see a lot of ut plus the subjunctive, and that's going to be one of the primary things they're going to be needing to spot and work out what kind of construction they're in. And so we're starting out in chapter 4 with ut in result clauses, meaning that for a result. Then in 25, when we introduce the indirect commands, we move on to adding the meaning to, so, you know, I'll order you to do something, where again, where the student might say, oh, I order you that you should pick up your book. So we're expanding that meaning slightly in a way that will make sense to them. Before in chapter 26, we'll move on to the purpose clauses, where they are going to translate with ut to mean in order that. So we're gradually building up the meanings that they see for that word in a way that will hopefully make them least likely to try to translate it in the way that isn't appropriate for the construction. Now, looking at the next section, you'll see that the colours are changing, and that's because by the end of chapter 26, we have, this is for the UK teachers, essentially covered all of the grammar syllabus content for EDUCAS. So if you're an EDUCAS teacher, you know that from now on, the content of the book will not be the constructions that your students will see in unseen text in their examination. And that will be helpful in working out how you might want to approach the next chapter's linguistic content. If you're an OCR teacher, by the end of the course, you'll have seen all of the grammar and syntax syllabus content for that GCSE by the end of chapter 32, so by the end of the book. And if you're an EDUCAS teacher, you'll probably find that most of these topics that are covered in chapters 27 to 32 will be very useful to helping your students prepare to read original Latin text for the prescribed text part of your syllabus. So in the East chapters, you'll see we're covering the ablative absolute, and we're going to pick up some more pronouns like ipse, and idem is coming later in chapter 30. We're dotting those around so that exposure to those is gradual and they feel that they've seen quite a lot of it, rather than bunching them together in one chapter and making it feel like, oh goodness, which one is this and what do I do with it? Again, we'll try as much as possible to allow them to build up their confidence by putting it into the text as much as possible. We're looking at the imperfect and pluperfect passive subjunctives and comparative adverbs in 28. And then in chapter 29, we'll be doing indirect statements, one of the meatier OCR topics, which will have a chapter by itself, including all of the infinitives that you might see in those constructions. So perfect active, perfect passive, and future active as well. Chapter 30, we'll look at the future. So this is going to be a chapter that I don't doubt will have lots of people making plans with the future participle and the future passive. Chapter 31 will have verbs of fearing and the ablative of comparison. I'm sure we're all looking forward to that. And we're finishing up with add plus the gerundive for purpose in chapter 32, so that even in the final chapter of the course, there will be lots of looking to the future and purpose going on as we finish up the plot lines. You'll see dotted around lots of topics here that I haven't touched on, particularly like verbs with taking the genitive or ablative. So looking at a range of verbs that take a complement in a case that students might not find immediately obvious. Dum and the subjunctive. These are smaller topics that are unlikely to be the meat of a chapter, but we've made sure that they're all accounted for as well. So if they're part of your syllabus content, your students will get plenty of exposure to them by the end of chapter 32. I imagine there might well be questions about the linguistics map at the end, so we'll welcome your ideas then, and Will might also be happy to talk about this because it's one of his favourite things. But we'll move on for now to talking about what happens in the chapters 17 through 32. So at the end of book 1, everything is up in the air, what's happening to our characters, and we'll try to tell you bits about book 2 without giving away everything, because I know that as you will be reading it for the first time, I'm sure you'll want to discover what happens to your favourite characters alongside your students. And I'll start you off by telling you a little bit about chapters. No, I won't. I will hand over to Hannah, who's going to tell you about chapter 17 to 19 in Pompeii.
Thank you, Lila. Okay, yeah, so we start out in book 2 in Pompeii. So that's a town I'm sure quite a lot of you know lots about. It's 66 AD, so it's still a few years short of the eruption, but there might be some rumbles and tremors. And the characters in Pompeii that you're familiar with are Gisco and his son, Curax and Quartilla, and of course Keller obviously joins them too. So we'll just fill in what happened with these characters since we last saw them in chapter 12. So we do find out that sadly Catia died in the fire in Rome. So Gisco is here in Pompeii looking after infants who finally has a name. So he is Rufus, although he doesn't have his mother's red hair. And when the building collapsed around Catia, it was actually Quartilla who managed to save Rufus, although she was also injured. And after the fire in Rome, Rufina set out to the east, and so we find out in these chapters that Rufina had actually sold Quartilla and Curax to Gisco before her journey. And as a thanks for saving his son, Gisco has freed Quartilla, and so she is set up in Pompeii, running a popina for herself. But Corax is still enslaved and working for Gisco. So in these chapters, Quartilla is working hard and desperately trying to save enough money to buy the freedom of her son from Gisco. Gisco set himself up making and selling wine from his vines on Vesuvius. And so in delivering some of these wines to clients, we get to see inside some of the grand, lovely houses that we find in Pompeii. And Gisco also sets himself up with a patron, the powerful Numerius Papidius Ampliatus. But it's not all easy. And we see Gisco struggling with some of the dodgy dealings of his new patron. So in the context of the death of a wealthy Pompeian, we look at funerary practices, and along with that, the worship of Isis and the Roman beliefs about life after death. And then, so next slide. Is that in Pompeii, along with these characters that we already know, we meet some new characters. And so they also allow us to look at some of the local trades and businesses. And we've based these characters on archaeological findings in Pompeii. So first, we've got Julia Felix, who is well known as the owner of a big complex on the east of the town in Pompeii. And her name comes from a notice offering rooms to rent in her complex. And actually, this is where Gisco, Rufus, and Corax are staying. So she has some rooms to rent, but in our stories, she also has flower gardens. And from these, she's making lovely perfumes. So we look a bit at the process of making perfume and the kind of flower industry in chapter 17. We also meet Umbricia Fortunata, who is a freedwoman of Umbricius Scaurus. And so Umbricius Scaurus is a big producer of garum, the fish sauce. So we look at the production and trade of garum in Pompeii. And in chapter 18, Quartilla and Umbricia, who are friends, make a new recipe for garum. So maybe there's some hope with this successful new product that Quartilla will be able to buy her son's freedom. And we also meet Numerius Papidius Ampliatus, who, as I said before, is a wealthy freedman and Gisco's new patron. And we know about Ampliatus from an inscription at the Temple of Isis in Pompeii. And it was actually Ampliatus who paid for the restoration of the temple after the big earthquake in AD 62. And he paid for it in his son's name, Celsinus. So he was only 6 years old at the time, but he is awarded a seat on the town council. So with this narrative in the story, we look at the status of freedmen, and also through this, we look at Ampliatus and Gisco's business, so the production of wine and its importance in daily life, particularly in Pompeii.
Thank you. Moving on, we're going to leave Gisco in Pompeii and meet up with Sabina, who is now living with Alexander in Carthage in North Africa. You can see them in the bottom left image. There's Alexander and Sabina having a walk by the seashore. They've moved there to undertake some work. So Sabina's helping Alexander in his mosaic making business. And they've settled there already by the time of our stories. And we first meet them on their way to the Amphitheater to go and see a gladiatorial show. So we start off with chapter 20, looking at amphitheaters and gladiators, as well as beast fights in the amphitheater. And in these three chapters, we'll see, as well as the amphitheater, we'll look at animals in the Roman world. So we're going to see the different relationships that Romans have with animals, whether they are pets or pack animals. We're going to look at adornment of women particularly, and cosmetics and jewelry, clothing, what women wore and how they made themselves up. And in the final chapter of the section, we'll be looking at birth and childhood, as well as education. And we've got a few characters who are new on the scene through whose eyes we'll be exploring these topics. So the bottom right-hand corner, you'll see an image of Sabina and Alexander together with a woman called Hermione, and that's her little baby there. Sadly, this is not Sabina and Alexander's baby that's being held. Alexander and Sabina are having trouble forming a family, and it's putting a strain on them both. So we'll see in these chapters how this turns out for them as they try whatever they can think of to see if they might be blessed with a child. And they also meet two new characters. They become very good friends with a woman called Hermione, and Hermione is someone for whom we have evidence from a mummy, Fayum mummy. So you can see her there. And I don't know if you'll be able to make it out, but in Greek, it just is written next to her head that her name is Hermione Gramaticaire. So Hermione is a teacher, maybe one of the first, maybe the first female teacher for whom we have archaeological evidence. And so we actually know what she looked like because we've got this gorgeous portrait of her that you can still see today in a museum here in Cambridge. So she's a teacher, and she teaches youngish students, so not in their final phase of education, but at the grammarian phase. So we'll be seeing education through her point of view. She is sadly alone. We do not have, no, I should say, we don't actually know at all whether Hermione was alive at this time. Her portrait is from anywhere between 60 and 140 AD, potentially. But we imagine that Hermione has made her way to Carthage, and she's living there, and she's got a little baby to look after. But her husband has sadly not survived. So she's a single mum looking after a little child while making a living in Carthage and befriends Sabina and Alexander. And on the right-hand side, the bloody man is Barca, and he is a Carthaginian gladiator who has for many years now been fighting in the arena, and he is hoping for his freedom. And when his freedom doesn't get given to him freely, he is going to try to make his own luck and see if he can manage to escape from his lot and find freedom for himself. I won't give away what happens to him, but I will say we've made a real effort to kill fewer people in book 2 than has happened previously in book 1. And there may be some happy endings to some of our storylines. You'll have to read chapter 22 to find out. And after our section in North Africa, we'll move on to a single chapter set in Rome where we catch up with Lucilius. Lucilius is receiving an unexpected promotion from the emperor in chapter 23. So through that topic, we'll be looking at the Curses of Norum for a guy like Lucilius, as well as so looking at both the Curses of Norum for equestrians and patricians, and touching on empire management, because the job that Lucilius is going to be given will take him to Greece, where we'll set future chapters. So he's already been a tribune in Spain under Otho, and now he'll be moving east towards Greece. We'll also meet 2 new characters who both are historical characters. We'll meet Locusta, you'll see her there in her workshop, the famous poison maker from the era of Nero. And we'll meet Epaphroditus, one of Nero's freedmen, who would lead a long and happy, who would lead a longer life and later serve under Domitian as well. So the bottom right-hand inscription shows him as an Augusti Libertus, an imperial freedman. And the left-hand picture shows what we might imagine the imperial administration areas might look like, full of men with maps administering this vastly growing empire on behalf of the emperor. And once Lucilius has received his promotion, he'll be traveling to Greece, and that's where chapters 24 to 26 take place. And these chapters coincide with Nero's tour of Greece, who at this time, so I think we're talking 66 and 67 AD, was traveling there with his entourage, going around Greece, having a great time, performing in poetry and music competitions, and being an amazing sportsman as well, winning, I think, all of the games extraordinarily, even holding the Olympics twice every year. So we're going to look at sports and the body, rhetoric, oratory and philosophy, music and poetry. These are, we're talking about Roman sports. We're not going to look at the ancient Greek Olympics, but being in Greece, we will touch on Greek culture as well and its relationship to the Roman world. And Lucilius will travel, of course, with Tyro, his trusted family slave, who will be going along, and we'll find out a bit more about him as well. And these chapters will show us some more sides to Lucilius's character as well that have so far been unexplored. And in these chapters, we'll start out in Athens, which is a place that Lucilius has been as a younger man for his education, and now is happy to return to see the culture. And touch briefly on Corinth, where Nero is undertaking the first ever person to try to dig the Corinth Canal. I think he doesn't manage it, but he does make a valiant effort. And then we've got chapter 25 set in Olympia, where we're going to look at sports, and chapter 26 at Delphi, where Nero is going to seek for some advice about how to prolong his life. Sadly, I don't think it's going to be very successful for him. Before we move on to the East, Hannah.
Yeah, so in chapters 27 to 29, we are heading east, and more specifically, we are heading to Ephesus. So that's where Rufina has settled after leaving Rome after the fire. But she's not there alone. She also has Lucria with her, who is still enslaved. And since her arrival, Rufina's been working helping the poor and healing, and she's learned a lot about herbs and medicines. So right from the start, from chapter 1, we've seen Rufina helping Manius in the street. And here in Ephesus, we find out a bit more about Roman medicine and health and kind of herbal remedies. And in Ephesus, we also look at the fantastic Temple of Artemis, which is one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And you can see a kind of a reproduction here. And in this setting, we look at tourism and travel and also communication. So the idea that in an empire that's so vast and without internet, obviously, without even like a good kind of public post service, just the kind of questions of how news travels and the difficulty of kind of keeping up to date and keeping in touch, particularly when you move around and how you keep in contact with people. And then similarly in the empire, we look at propaganda and how the news travels to all the sides of the empire. So what Rome and an emperor such as Nero would mean to someone living so far away in Ephesus, who might only have seen his face on a coin. But after a mysterious death, Rufina, the doctor, is accused and arrested. And we look a bit at magic and superstition, particularly around women, and how that can sometimes overlap both with kind of medicines and poisons. So Rufina, we have her in quite a bad situation. And so, yeah, we'll have to hope and see whether she can clear her name. And then finally, we reach the climax of book 2. We're back in Rome. And by some fortune or divine will, we see some of our Suburani characters are reunited. But who will make it back? You know, we will have to read and see. Will Sabina and Alexander still be together? We're going to leave some of that for you to read and find out with your students this summer or next September. But at the same time, it's AD 68, so the end of Nero is coming, and we look at soothsayers and augurs in the context of Nero's dreams and fears. And then we see the fighting outside Rome, so the armies of Verginius and Vindex and Galba, and we look in a little more detail at the structure of the army and military command and the forces as they build up around Nero and around Rome. And then back in Rome for chapter 32, and we look at the reception of Nero. And so similarly as we did in chapter 12, we can look at some ancient sources about him, and then some modern historians and archaeologists, and maybe reevaluate him a little if there's any redeeming factors, or maybe there's not. And that's something you and your students can discuss. And then we end up with, so, you know, some of our Suburani is reunited back together in the Subura, probably back in a Peppina, maybe with a parrot, telling each other some stories about all the crazy adventures they've had. Great, and then so I'll just talk quickly through the myth and history chapters. So as in book 1, each chapter contains 1 page of either myth or history. And these usually alternate each chapter, but there are a few chapters where you'd have 2 history and 2 mythology in a row. And they always have a connection to the civilization content in the chapter and to the storyline, but they do also sit separately from the core content. So if you're teaching on a short time scale, they might be something you can't dedicate too much time to, but at the same time, if you have more time, there could be a springboard for some really, like, you know, good research topics or projects for your students. So we look at the history first. So the history pages in the textbook are not organized in chronological order. So they aim to cover kind of highlights of Roman history and to investigate some big interesting topics, but they won't take you kind of step by step through Roman history. So instead the topics are more thematic and encourage students to think about a theme across different time periods and also across various places in the empire. And these pages should also help contextualize the other content in the chapter, and also sometimes help the students understand kind of the importance of the history of Rome and how what came before has helped construct the systems that they're learning about now. So for example, in 23, when we look at the Curses of Norum and the management of the empire and the civilization, and Lucilius is sent to Greece as the quaestor of the province of Achaia. So here, the history topic is looking at the construction of the Principate, so then the decisions that Octavian made in retaining the Senate and the balance of power. So this helps the students' understanding of the relationship between the Senate and the emperor. And in the case of our stories, they can see that Nero is not really maintaining that balance. And then the next chapter, when we're in Greece with Lucilius, and he's looked around the Parthenon, we've had some philosophical debates in the Abagora. So then the history page investigates the relationship between Greece and Rome, and the ongoing interplay between the cultures. So there's a full timeline of the interactions between the two civilizations. And that's also to remind students that they existed simultaneously. There wasn't Greece and then Rome. And there's quite a range of topics, and they're structured quite differently in the history section. So the first topic, the Archaeology of Pompeii, allows you to go into more depth about conservation and the role that museums have in preserving the findings and making them accessible to the public. So if you're interested, you could go into more depth about the new discoveries and new techniques in archaeology. And there's also a wide geographical spread. So there's a chance to look at the populations of Africa and Greece and the East before the arrival of the Romans, and then how that changed. Yeah, like I said, each of these topics could be a kind of a springboard to further research into any of these particular topics or cultures. So now we look at the mythology topics coming up. So similarly, some of these are provisional, but most of these are set. And as in book 1, the mythology page doesn't tell the story of the myth. So instead it provides some topics for discussion and it's sources to study around the story. So it's a great opportunity to look at some ancient but also some modern art, and also have some discussions about some Roman ideas, and in some cases to approach some slightly more sensitive topics, like such as gender in the context of myth, which might be easier for some students. And again, there are a wide range of myths and topics which come out from and the topics that come out from them introduce lots of discussions and questions, such as kind of like ideals of beauty and death in the afterlife, and looking into the future and the idea of fate. And so these pages help to look at the reception of classics over time, particularly when we look at some of those modern visual sources. And they can also help with a kind of connection to the Romans and the ancient world. And so we see that we're still telling some of the same stories and asking some of the same questions as the Romans did, which I think is really helpful when you're studying an ancient culture. And now I'll pass over to Tony for an update on the tech.
Okay, I'm going to just swap over to my browser so that we can see some tech. Ah, that worked?
I think that's working, Tony, yeah.
Oh, I can't see it. Okay, okay. To cover general things before we get going on everything else, a lot of you already on book 1, I'll be moving on to book 2 and be interested to know what happens to their classes, what happens to their students' data and so on. And the idea is that everything will be smoothly done. If you've got a class of students that you want to move on to book 2 and they largely go together, you'll be able to move them across, rename the class, allocate new teachers and so on. All the data for your students will remain. So if they've been doing the vocabulary trainer or any other exercises, that will be retained and it'll be a continuum. I mean, though we've got 2 books, it really is 32 chapters, one after another. You will need to renew your school registration and pay for the second year of usage of the digital materials, but we'll be sending out reminders about that. So, you know, don't worry, you're not going to get cut off. but you will get some kind of warning that you need to sort of renew again. In general, about the user management, we're going to add a lot more things that you can do yourselves. So this is the signing up, signing in, setting up teachers, classes and students. And you'll be able to add teachers, remove teachers from a class. And you can share classes between teachers. And similarly, you'll be able to add student to a class or remove them, move them to another class. And that'll all be in your student management pages, your school management pages. So it'll be much easier. I mean, some of you have wanted that kind of facility this year, and we've done it for you. It hasn't been much of a problem, but it'll be easier if you can do it yourself. So that'll be coming in as well. The main thing to say about book 2 is that we're just carrying on with what we've got for book 1. Everything we've had there will continue, and we'll be adding extra things. So just as a recap, every chapter has got what we call the chapter page, which is the sort of digital starting point for all the sort of surrounding materials, the ancillary materials, both printed and digital activities and so on. You have web links, so you can find curated lists of links to stuff elsewhere on the web. There's a image gallery. These are very high quality, so that if you've got a projector or a interactive whiteboard or something, you can display them there in high detail. And as before, we've got activities, vocabulary trainer and so on, maps, dictionary, and as you can see at the bottom, there are teacher resources, both provided by us within Hands Up and also community ones. We've had a lot of people providing fantastic materials to share with other teachers, and we're really pleased about that, and we're hoping that will expand still further. Obviously this is chapter 17, so only the trial schools have been using it so far, so we haven't got so many there. The other thing that every chapter has got is what we call the active book, which is a digital version of the chapter. In fact, I've got it here. Here's what I've got things open. So effectively, you've got these bars you can click on to open, and you can see the highly illustrated stories. Differences compared to the book is you can click on a word and you'll get a parsing and a gloss for that word. So it does help with reading very much. You've probably seen you can also get roots. So if you click the roots at the top here, certain words are underlined. This is going to be enriched further as we add more words that say Surrey, and you get information about how that word's used in, has sort of come into other languages like French and Spanish and Portuguese and so on. Turn that off and go down. You'll be familiar with this from what you've seen already, but for some people who haven't got into the course yet, this is the kind of thing you'll see. Here's an ordinary textual story, again with the same kind of parsing and gloss for the words. You can turn the parsings off if you want, so you just get the glosses. And then we get into the representations of the civilization pages. Very nice here. Again, a bit of interactivity, so you can actually get more information by clicking on the various parts of an interactive image and so on. There's language notes from the book, language exercises, and down at the bottom, things about archaeology, the history and mythology. So that's what we've got already, and we'll have all of those for book 2 as well. The vocabulary trainer, I'll just have to refresh that. Again, you'll know how this works. a minute, sorry. Yeah. This is my test page, so it's a very random selection of chapters that I've been testing myself on, but you can get introduced to new words here. Then you get multiple choice questions that you can click on. If you get it wrong, you have to click on the right one. And then there are sort of typing in questions as well, but all familiar stuff, but it's extending right through to a whole 640 words we'll have. We've got 20 learning words per chapter. So we've had 320 words in book 1, 320 in book 2. Great thing about this for UK teachers is that covers all the words that you will encounter in your defined vocabulary list for EDUCAS and for OCR. And if you're in North America, you will see that a large number of the words in the Dickinson 500 list, which lists the most frequently used words in Latin, they're also in our vocabulary list, but it's been very carefully curated so that people would be familiar with whatever course or whatever exam they might want to do in future. They've got a really good basis for going forward. Don't know where that scribble came from. That's interesting, but yeah. Can you see that on the screen? Yeah. Anyway, this is just to say students can see how they're getting on. So if I look on chapter 1, this is sort of my progress in the vocab trainer. And I won't show it now, but the teacher, for all the students in the class, can see exactly the same information for all the students. Very useful. Now I'll show you something which is a new, we've been trialing it without tracking, but now we've got it with tracking, and this is the Automark Translations. This is a little class I've got of just two students, very nice. And say we look at Billy Budd, he's done pretty badly on exercise 11.2. This is where you get presented with a Latin sentence and then type in your translation, and the program marks it automatically for you and gives you a mark. And this is a summary of how Billy Budd did on that particular exercise. So what we're going to do now is give Billy Budd a chance to redeem himself by improving. So he's gone back into exercise 11.2. You can see it up at the top here. This is the sentence, Lucreo pecuniam cibumque ferebat. And he types, typing fast, Lucreo was stealing food and money. Let's see what that comes up with. Yeah, so it didn't like stealing, carrying is better. I'll just go quickly through this. Yeah, it doesn't look perfect. There we go. He's typed in door instead of port, met instead of came upon, and sailor rather than ship. He's got 60% for that one. Again, misplaced great with Corsica rather than with the rivers. Hasn't seen the macra and so on. And other instead of altos, but let's see. Yeah, they've got that. And finally, Sabina cum nauta veteri humanique artifice navigabat. Yeah, got a bit adrift at the end there, but anyway, let's see what it makes of that. Still not bad, 67%. And at that point, you've run through all the questions, you say next, and you get the summary of how you did in that. But now if we go back and reload that class, my 7Z, you can see that 72 mark has gone up from 35. So instantly through the server on our server, the data is updated and the teacher can keep track of how the students are doing in the class. And as we go further on, we're going to add more sort of analysis software. So teachers can rank students and with a vocab trainer, they can sort of see which words are causing most problem across the cohort and so on. Now we're going to take this tracking facility, it will look very similar for things like the sorting activity that we've got here as well. I think you'll have seen this before. I don't want to spend much time on it because we're going to run into the question and answer time. So was there anything else I wanted to talk about? And I think I'll stop there so that people can ask questions. The idea is that we're going to have more tracking going into it. We do invite any queries or suggestions for improvements, things you'd like to see. And actually over the year, we've been listening to people writing in and making improvements, making changes and so on. If you find any bugs, we definitely want to hear about them. Don't just suffer in silence and sort of say, oh, well, it's just, you know, it's a program that have bugs in. We'll fix them if we know about them. And so please do let us know. And the contact for that is contact@handsupeducation.org. If you go to the Hands Up website, it's down at the bottom, the email address, contact@handsupeducation.org. And we'd really love to hear from you. Okay, so I'll hand back, I'll come off there. And I think we'll go into questions now.
Great, thanks, Tony. One question that's just come in at the end, I think most things we sort of dealt with as we went along. One question that came in at the end, Tony, was when will the auto-marking translation, I know obviously it's working in terms of automatically marking the activities that the students do. What about that storage of it and displaying the results back to the teacher? I've said, I know you've got it working at your end in your sort of offline thing. What's your thinking about when you'll be able to push that out to?
Within the next week, really. There's no reason. I mean, I've been testing it and you saw it working there, but that was locally on my local server. But yeah, there's no reason we can't have that. Sorry, my screen's gone funny. In the next week or so, if people want to start using that.
Yeah, I think that would be good. And I think probably most of us would feel, let's try it. And if it's a little bit, you know, wonky and not everything works perfectly, then, you know, we'll find out. We'll let you know. But probably it will be pretty smooth. So I guess where we know is start of January. So what we're thinking, probably my sense is then from what you're saying, in the next couple of weeks, we should be out there. Those of you who are using book one, that should just sort of appear on the sort of class management interface, if that makes sense. Does that sound fair, Tony?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a kind of generic approach I've had, so that when we do the sorting exercises or the closed questions, the word ending type of questions, they'll slot into that very easily. So suddenly you'll find there are quite a few of the activities. Some of them actually aren't out there yet, but they will come out with the additional tracking for you to see how your students are doing across the board.
Great, great.
It will appear, but also we will send you an update. So any teachers who are logged on with students online, you should be getting updates from Suburani. I mean, we've only sent a couple so far. We don't want to clog up your inboxes, but yeah, we'll let you know so you don't need to keep reloading just to check.
Yeah, and a few of us saying, because we're moving to online teaching, and I know some of us in the US have been online like a lot this last semester. And are you still online? Some people in the US still online or going back online? I know some people are online and offline and so on. And the UK is going online for, well, of course, you know, they tell us 2 weeks. Who knows? So, okay, so I think that would be appreciated. Susie, you've said, could we put the other subjunctives? Because I think Donna, you were saying, look, does this cover 3? And the NLE3. It's all the nomenclatures have changed, haven't they? Slightly intermediate. As I said there in the chat, we've got in terms of the subjunctives, we've got the imperfect and the pluperfect in book 2, because they're the ones that are easy to spot, really. Is the present and the perfect are a bit trickier. So for sure, Susie, no problem, we could make some offline materials. But the only slight concern that I'd have and I'm sure we can do it, the only slight problem for the students is that it would be tricky to put examples of the present and the perfect subjunctives in the stories. So then it becomes one of those things where it's in the offline material, they sort of do it, and then they don't get it reinforced as they go along. And then the answer to that, of course, is, well, let's write some more stories offline to go. And I would say, one or two of you have sent in stories, and don't think there's anything special about us. We write the stories, we sit down, we look at the information, we think, okay, we've got to write a story. It's got to be sort of engaging. It's got to, the stories in the book have to take the overall plot forward in a way that works out, so that have we said what happens at the end of 32? Because sometimes I was chatting. Are we going to say what happened? Well, I think we've said the timeline finishes in 68 AD.
Yeah.
And we see a lot of Nero in book 2, so maybe I don't know whether we should say what happens at the end of it, but you might guess. Anyway, I forget where I was. In terms of getting these subjunctives, offline stories. If you guys want to write stories, please do. I think we feel this isn't our textbook, of course. It is for you guys. It's for everybody. So everybody can make stories and so for those offline stories that could then include things that have been taught additionally offline, that would be a good way of of the students seeing more examples of something like the present and pluperfect subjunctive, present and perfect subjunctive in the context of a story. Do you guys in the UK, it's not a thing, but in the US, would that be useful, do you think, to have that, have the present? Let's see, a lot of nodding going on. Those of you with your cameras turned off, I can't see you nodding, but everyone who I know is in the US is also nodding. So, okay, lots of definitelys. Okay, we'll add that to the to-do list then. But very genuinely, don't feel, I think it's really easy, isn't it, when we're teaching to think, oh, I couldn't do that, I'm not, I'll do my thing to my own class, but I don't feel confident sharing. There's please do feel confident, or just send it to us, and then, we can look at it, and we're absolutely brutally honest with everybody. So, we won't say it's great if it isn't. So do feel free to send it, whatever it is. Okay, I've missed now what's happening in the chat.
I think someone raised their hand. Was it Sarah Holiday? Is that right? If you still got a question, do you want to unmute?
Oh no, I've put it down again because someone answered it. I've just been really stupid. I couldn't find something. All right, don't worry.
Okay.
Perfect.
Yeah. I see a comment here about a novella, and yeah, Hillary's written a novella. For those of you in the UK, novellas aren't really a thing so much in the UK, but they're a big thing in the US. And Hillary just said she fancied writing a novella. Would that be okay? Well, yeah, of course it's okay. So, and I think Lila and Hannah, you guys are more on the ball with that than I am, but I think there's another one in the pipeline, and then maybe another one. So is that right? Is that?
Yeah, Hillary is a very prolific novella author. Well, I mean, the question is for us to keep up with publishing them. So I think there's going to be another one coming in the new year once we get round to the final checks and proofreads and the process of typesetting and printing.
Yeah, and again, if others of you think, actually, I'd like to have a go at that, it is absolutely not something that we in the UK know much about, but we can certainly, help with certain things. So if people fancy it, again, have a go. I think we feel our complete focus between now and the summer has got to be on book 2 and making sure book 2 comes in time, because, I know very much that those of you are going to be teaching it next year. Some of you start at the beginning of August. Well, you can't get a book in August and then teach it in August. You've got to have that book, June time. So we've got to make sure that we keep that, that on target. So it might be that we have to sort of prioritize the rest of, real hard focus on the end of book 2 between now and at our end, sort of May, and then really beyond May, it's got to be with the printer and then with the warehouse and all of that, so we don't have to worry too much from that stage. So, but beyond May, we can pick up other things. Okay. So, Sarah, your question about where the words to learn list, is that sorted? Is that the one? Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
so reference grammar. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, yeah. Are there any other questions that we've got coming in? So Donna, you said, of course.
We've got a hand raised from
Yeah.
Marcy.
Hi, I typed it in the chat, but the chat moves so quickly. I am planning to finish book 1 with my students at the end of February. And so I know the book won't be released until the summer, but is there any way, and I'm willing to work with anything. My colleague actually trialed book 1 whenever that was, I guess last year or the year before. Anyway, I was wondering if there's any way to get the most draft forms of the first few chapters, which is probably all I would need with my 8th graders, between late February and late May.
I think we could, as long, Marcy, and anybody else who's interested in this sort of thing, I would say probably yes, but there's some caveats. One, you have got to give us feedback. And that has got to include things like, well, there's a typo, or this isn't right, all that. And it's got to include things like, this story is dreadful, or whatever, so you've got to be honest. It depends when that happens. It might actually be too late for us to build some of those things that you might flag up. If we've got to get this book out for June, and if you tell us, in March, well, this entire storyline is dreadful, we are not going to be able to rewrite it for June. But we could at least say, okay, well, 2nd edition, that is something we're going to have to come back to. So there'll be that. You have to commit to giving us feedback. You're going to have to accept that things change. We get to a point where we think, actually, this bit isn't going to work here, and so we're going to have to go back there and change this thing. So I know some of you who were trying in book 1 last year said, who are these new people? They seem to be the same as these old people, and we just changed some people's names because the names didn't work out later on. Or sometimes when we're writing, we use sort of holding names and then go back and sort them out. So probably, okay, if you're willing to try it and put up with some bumpiness, and for sure, if book 1, you're coming through book 1 and then it's going to end, then that makes sense, doesn't it? You've got to have something to do with the students. So I would say, if you're in that position, you're using book 1, it's going to end this year, and you've got 4-6 months, you've got to do something with the kids. I'm sure we can sort something out then. Yeah. I mean, it would have to be digital and PDF based. But yeah. What we're not going to do, and some of you have asked, or some people have asked this along the way, what we're not going to do is give out free copies of book 2 as inspection copies, because every time we do that, it costs about sort of £20, $30 by the time it's done. And the real reason for giving out free copies of book 1 to schools is so that people get an idea of what it looks like overall. We can't really, well, we could afford to do it, but it would probably cost about $40,000, £30,000. And all that money is for you guys. So, we could either give it to schools to have a free copy of book 2 each, or we could say, actually, just you have to pay for a copy of book 2 to see if you like it or not. But then there's, 30 or 40K to put into other things of, further developments and so on. So my feeling is that we should be a bit mean in terms of book 2 inspection copies. But for sure, the first couple of chapters of book 2 will be free online, just as they are for book 1. And really, the whole book thing is a bit spurious. We're writing 32 chapters, and every one of them, looks pretty much the same. So I hope that's okay. If any of you's in a situation where, What we definitely don't want is anyone using their own personal money to pay to do their job. If you're in that situation, you think, well, you know, I'll have to ask, you know, a great aunt Flo if she can lend me £20 for a book or whatever it might be. You know, let us know. We can always sort that sort of thing out. Okay, are there been more questions coming in?
Yeah, I think there's one question here that says, can we talk a little bit about the potentially adult themes in book 2 and whether the content will be appropriate for middle school, so US grades 6 to 8 students?
Yeah, it's a good, I mean, I'll kick off with some things that were in my head because I've answered some emails about this. In chapter 19 in Pompeii, you know, it's quite a sad situation. There's a death in Pompeii. It's not the death of someone who's a core character in the story, because Lila, you were saying earlier on, you know, I think there was a sort of feeling that the course was turning into a little bit of sort of The Sopranos or something, and people were being wiped out. So we didn't want that, but there is chapter 19 deals with the death, and it deals with the procession through Pompeii, and it deals with, you know, what happens then in terms of the cremation and so on. Not obviously not so lots of details, but is there? So that's a bit difficult. We've sort of wondered quite a lot about what to do about sexuality and homosexuality and bisexuality in the ancient world. And that, Lila, you've sort of, you know, you've done a lot of work on that, but we've also all done a lot of thinking on that. And we don't want to not cover it as though it didn't exist. And we don't want to do it in a way which is, you know, gratuitous and you know, and sort of too, because not we don't want to do it in a way which is too obvious either, because a lot of people would be uncertain about that, I think. And we're doing it when we're in Greece. One of the problems that we've got is the reality of how it seems, and Lila, you must correct me because I will probably get this wrong. One of the problems we've got is that although very wealthy or very high status Romans might have been comfortable with, isn't the right word, is it? Although let's take someone like Emperor Hadrian. He was, if I'm right, openly homosexual, and that was accepted. But from what we can see, and you know, I think, again, Lila, correct me if I'm wrong, what we can see is that if you were a homosexual man in the lower echelons of Roman society, you probably weren't openly homosexual, because if I'm right, the graffiti and the text that we can read about that are not, you know, are quite unpleasant towards homosexual men. And I'm not sure there's anything about homosexual women that we've got. So it's got, what we do has got to be accurate historically. We can't paint a picture of the Romans as people they weren't. And we want to look at this through as far as we can through the eyes of our characters. So we've got a scene in chapter 24 or 25, chapter 24, I think, where it becomes clear that Lucilius had a homosexual relationship when he was in Greece, when he was younger. And he meets up with his earlier lover, and because he's now carried on, he's started to go at the Curses of Norum, that side of his life he has put behind, and he maybe has to deny, you know, his feelings and so on. So we touch on it very lightly there, I think, in a way where if people felt uncomfortable, you know, in middle school of covering that sort of thing, you could probably skip the story, or skip part of the story. Also, we're looking at the myth in the following chapter, I think it is, of Echo and Narcissus, where, of course, Narcissus, well, we think he falls in love with himself. Well, he doesn't know it's himself, does he? He's falling in love with a reflection of a man, an image of a man. So that's there in the same sort of area. So we touch on that a little bit, hopefully in a way which is, allows people who want to explore that side of things more to do so, and allows those who are in situations where they can't really to move along. So we've got those. Those are two obvious areas. Can anyone else think of other? I know I've put in an email to one or two people who've asked.
I would say that I don't think that spring to mind to me any particular stories that would be, shocking or inappropriate for students at that age. But I think there are quite a lot of storylines where you will have to work harder with them to understand what's at stake. So when we're talking about Sabina and Alexander trying to have a baby, some of the storylines are moving towards things that will be less easy for a middle school or even a high school student to empathize with, to feel like they've been exposed to a lot. And so we're looking at stories that are becoming a little bit more interactive with the history as well. So they do evolve. They do become a bit more adult in content in that sense. But I don't think there are many topics there that would be considered particularly difficult to broach or shocking, which is maybe less exciting for them than it would be for slightly older students.
Can I ask a follow-up question to that? Are you going to make available maybe the research behind some of the plot elements, so we can say to middle school students, hey, here's why this is here, because we found this inscription in Pompeii and it says XYZ. I think that might be helpful with, because our parent community certainly likes to think of themselves as being very progressive, but then, little Will comes home from school talking about the story that he read in Latin class today, and they want to know why the heck I've put the story in front of their kid. Does all that make sense?
Yeah, it does, Stuart. Thanks. I think, yes, certainly in time we can always do more of that sort of thing. So if you ever come across something, whatever it is you think actually could do with more information on the background to that, as I said, the priority is to get book 2 itself out, and then after that we can sort of build around it. Some of that you're talking about would probably normally end up in the teacher's guide anyway, the teaching notes anyway, and if what's there isn't enough, just say, can you go back to what it was that you based this on, and then we can either update the teaching notes or we can put further stuff online for teachers for sure. So yeah, that makes sense in a range. The same thing with I think possibly with the with the funerary materials as well. We might be able to do that sort of thing. Yeah. There's a question, Amy, I think from you probably. We use Google Slides a lot. Online teaching, it'd be great if there was a way to format the stories or make the format of the stories easy. Yeah. Am I reading that correctly? I think there's overall an issue of how easily available do we make the text for stories, because you guys could type it all up, but there's no need to do that just seems like an unnecessary sort of amount of work. So I think I'm always a little cautious about saying let's release the text of all the stories in Word or something, but my sense is that maybe that's the sort of thing that we need to think about doing, because you want to create resources around them. There's no point sort of typing it all up. So I think as directors, we've talked about that in the past. We probably need to have a chat about it again, but I
end up taking screenshots of the pictures and then putting the text next to it. And like many of you, I have 5 classes that I'm trying to do that for online. Yeah. And, some of the stuff I've already made, but because Suburani's new, I just have to recreate it all. And, I love it enough that I'm willing to do it. But having the text, or like you guys do a great job of having the pictures, but even if we had them in some kind of a format where we could put them into, rather than like having to go on and make essentially, 150 pictures of one chapter and in various forms in order to talk about it on a Google slide.
Yeah, I think it makes sense, Amy, really, for the stories.
Well, we could buy the rights to it or something like that.
Well, I don't think you need to do it, because this, the whole thing, all of this is for you, right? So it is, I sort of feel like you guys own it. really. You know, that's, I think we have a little offline chat, the four of us, and then see, but maybe we can let everybody know, you know, if there's a position on that. Okay, yeah, just, I mean, I know you've come, is it Lila, you replied to Julia about the book 2 thing. I always panic about how many copies of the book we should print and if we're going to run out and all that sort of thing. So kind of handy if you know how many you're going to want of book 2. You know, we'll sort of probably print a ballpark number. We tend to try and print a smaller number for the first print because invariably you check it 1,000 times and then as soon as you print it, you notice some typos. So, you know, I'm still upset about noctium at the end of, don't mention it, no one would know, in the grammar for the back of book 1. But as soon as you print it, you know that you've got some mistakes. So we tend this summer to print a small number of book 2. And what we don't want to do is then, you know, people say, "Whoa, I'll have 200 copies, please." As occasionally happens, you know, that can sort of wipe stocks. It's sort of quite a number of schools. You can get through this quite quickly. So let us know if you can send it. If you, you know, if you're fairly certain it won't tie you to anything, but if you know that you're probably going to want 20 or 200 or whatever it is, just send us an email. We could sort of make sure that all works. So, yeah. Okay. What else have we got? Yeah. So Susie, this question, I mean, that is one of the issues when, you know, you've got a storyline where someone dies and there's something's happened within the family that makes that upsetting for a student. Yeah, it's just knowing your class well, isn't it? I tended to sit down with the students you know, at some point and say, look, this is going to happen. Do you feel comfortable being part of the college? Do you want to sit out in the library for a lesson or two and do, you know, so you work around things that sort of way. So what have you put? If I might just get the story back. Yeah, that's a good idea to ask online, ask on the Facebook group for how people handle that sort of thing. I mean, it's the same. So one of the things we didn't touch on with difficult issues is, and I think we can probably talk about it, the situation that we have with Sabina and Alexander not being able to have a child, you know, and it was really a plot device to start with, because we needed to get Sabina out of Carthage. And we thought, how can we get her out of Carthage? Well, how about Alexander and Sabina split up? You know, so, and we thought actually them struggling to have a child being the reason why they might split up will help explain to students how important children were to the concept of a Roman family, what one of the purposes of a familia was. So actually we've managed to sort of work it so it doesn't happen quite. So, yeah, sorry. But there is another, you know, there is another story there where there's divorce sort of on the cards. So that might be another area where if you know students are going through a difficult time with their parents splitting up at home, for example, that might be something to sort of think, well, again, should I just have a little chat and so on. I think one of the ways in which we've handled it actually should help to show students that although people, you know, they might have their differences, there's no animosity between Sabina and Alexander. So we see, to a certain extent, things sort of, you know, not working out in terms of their marriage, but they still, you know, they still love each other. So for me, I think there's something that students could see if their parents decide to go separate ways, in that it doesn't mean that, you know, everything else is broken down. So that makes sense. But yeah, Facebook good for chatting for that. Do we have any other questions and queries? Is there something that has come up in the chat that we've missed?
I think it's just a lot about this idea of making the stories available. So if we talk about that and get back to everyone. Oh, there's a hand up though. From, yeah.
Sarah?
Look, I'm not on a Kindle this time. I'm actually on a computer, so no fat fingers today. I was just, Sam, who is an old boy of my school, who's also here, but I never taught him. Just saying, I'm finding year 8, I find this really quite hard going, and I don't know if it's like a COVID thing. They seem to be going a lot slower, and I don't know if anyone else is feeling this. It's kind of hard to judge. So I've got to the end of chapter 3 with them on an hour a week, and that was where we planned to get to. And I don't know if that's sort of about where we should be, and if other people are finding that their students are not making the same amount of progress, because certainly, even though we did serious lockdown learning, they're just not used to being in a classroom environment. I don't know. I just wanted a general, is that okay? Is everyone else feeling this, or is it my boys who are...
For those of you in the US, UK year 8 is US 7th grade.
Yeah. Well, from the chat,
see the chat there, Sarah, but people are saying definitely, going very slowly.
Okay.
Behind.
Yeah.
Okay.
My own feeling, I mean, we can see by looking overall at the how people progress on the data in the vocab trainer, and that doesn't sound particularly sort of out of kilter. And you know, as for others to say as well what they think, but I would say, Sarah, it's just much better to go at a pace that works. You know,
Yeah.
And certainly in the UK with our exam system. I would have thought you'll be fine. There's plenty, you know, if they're learning Latin at all in year 8, it's fine, isn't it?
They're also selective. So, you know, I have already got a nice pool to pick from at the top. So, yeah, I just wondered if I was going at kind of, my colleague thinks I go really fast. And I'm like, no, this is a regular thing. And also because we're teaching year 9, I'm going to swear at you. Year 9 are on the way out in CLC book 1, parallel. And so they've had an year of extra Latin because we did Imperium, because I like the boxes. And so where we are with year 9, it's kind of a judgment against it. So yeah, we think year 8 are just a bit special rather than we're doing it wrong. Because they're loving it. They love the stories. Yeah. So yeah.
I think also for sure the start of Suburani goes more quickly in terms of the concepts than the start of the CLC. And I think one of the things we were quite keen to do is shift some of the load up front a little bit so that there's more time later on. So things don't just suddenly, you know, hit you. So I wouldn't be at all surprised, and certainly in the trials, you know, in a lot of UK schools, I think people are finding book 1 is sufficient for 2 years of material.
Yes, that's what our plan was. Yeah.
Sorry, you can't do that because, you know, you have to get to GCSE in, you know, 5 seconds. So yeah. So I think if you're in a UK school and you're thinking, actually, it might take me 2 years to do book 1, that's fine. I mean, you know, from you again in UK terms, the 2 books are meant to be the, you know, all the language content for the entire GCSE course, and you know, that I don't think there's any chapters, because they are all, you know, firmly 16 pages. There shouldn't be any chapters that take significantly longer than other. You don't have to think, well, when I get to the second book, all the chapters are going to take an extra week or 2. So, yeah, everyone's saying there's lots of things going on in the kids' lives as well. So.
Yeah.
Cool. Do we have other questions, queries? If there is, I mean, it's a little tricky, but you know, Lila showed us the language map earlier on, and then you can download that from the website, the draft one for book 2. If there's anything in sort of chapters 20, I would say 27 to 32, that is not good, then it is not too late to change that. So let us know. You know, there's a limited amount of ways in which we can move things around, but they can still be moved around. So let us know that. In terms of timescales, all things being equal, I reckon a print copy. Well, what do you think, Hannah? Print copy, sort of end of June, early July.
That's realistic, yeah. And I don't know about shipping and how long it will be anywhere.
It's a
printers. I think end of June sounds very doable.
Yeah, we had a big problem with COVID last summer, that because all the aircraft stopped flying, and because most freight from the UK to the US goes in the hold of passenger aircraft, all these copies of the books that we were trying to send to you guys were just sat, you know, because there weren't any place. So if anyone didn't get their copy, you know, do let us know. But it should be much easier now to get them across the pond, I think. Okay. If we're... Sorry, Lila.
Oh, I just spotted a question that Hannah might be able to speak to about whether the art in the book is at all based on the style of frescoes.
No, not particularly. They're just kind of my own sort of cartoon drawings. I mean, the fresco drawings are, of course, based on the original frescoes, but no, in general, I suppose maybe the colours I am a bit inspired by when in the past I've been travelling, been out, seen Pompeii and stuff. But yeah, no, I just try and make them as kind of engaging and realistic as possible.
And it's great that, I mean, Hannah's such a fantastic artist and illustrator, and it's great when, as you pointed out, Donna, you know, when the that sort of new bar in Pompeii was sort of, well, discovered and released, you know, immediately it was, well, you know, Hannah might be able to work that in, or we could, you know, get into the book somehow. So yeah, great. Okay, how are we doing? Are we sort of coming towards the end? Yeah, it's, I mean, it is fantastic, your artwork, and it's I want to say to the rest of the team, Tony, Hannah and Lila, many thanks for sort of picking up for me, because I've had to sort of jump across the border to France for a couple of weeks at short notice, and with everything that's going on in the UK at the minute, that wasn't straightforward. So thanks to all of you for picking up all of my sections today. Okay, well, if we're covered, then remember that, you know, we are always here at the end of the email, and if anyone wants to do a sort of a quick one-to-one Zoom about something, and the Facebook group is always, and thanks to those of you who set up the Facebook group and contribute, and those of you who create resources as well, thanks so much for everything that, you know, that you're doing. And any ideas, suggestions, complaints are fine, you know, feel free, it's okay to say this isn't right. And just please, yeah, keep sharing and let us know. Cool. All right. Well, we'll say goodbye, I guess, and good luck this term, this semester, everybody. Stay safe.